be held accountable. It is oftentimes forgotten as we celebrate the great Sir Arthur Lewis, whose centenary we celebrate this year, that in 1942, in his little book, Labor in the Caribbean, he argued that this crime of slavery has to be accounted for, and until it is accounted for, the Caribbean will not reach its maturity. We have been schooled to accept as a norm the widespread poverty in our midst. There is too much poverty in this Caribbean. This Caribbean has been built upon the impoverishment of our peoples. That was its overriding philosophy. We as Caribbean peoples today must say that we are committed to uprooting the normalcy of this poverty that is binding this region together. Poverty has been historically the norm, but cannot be the basis of a modern citizenship. It cannot be the basis of a modern citizenship. We have to confront all of those things that we were told to accept as a norm. I was very disturbed recently to hear a Caribbean Prime Minister articulating the view that poverty is a norm, and those of us in the academic world who wish to confront it and denormalize it are dreamers. I do not accept that poverty is a norm. It is historically manufactured, and it can be historically unrooted in the future. Let us look at the role of the state in all of this. We are being told of late that our systems of governance and our structures of state must be marginalized within our economic development models. If you examine the economic development of any successful nation on this planet, not one of them is based upon the notion of the marginalization of the state. All of them are based on the assumption that the state has a responsibility to provide and to create environments for individuals to act creatively and bring in values to their communities. All of them are based on the assumption that the states must pass laws and create legal infrastructures that are empowering of their citizens. All of them are based on the assumption that the state must in itself, as the custodian of the wealth of their societies, redirect that wealth in developing ways. For the Caribbean states to retreat into the margins of their cultures at this time will be to render our peoples even more vulnerable than they have been in the past. And we must confront these economic dogma that seek to impose upon us a language that is inconsistent with our historical past. Let us look at the issue of building entrepreneurship. All of us have been critical of the role of imperial entrepreneurships in our civilization. All of us have been calling for an indigenous Caribbean entrepreneurship that takes upon it as a responsibility the creation and redistribution of wealth for the benefit of Caribbean societies. To be critical of our relationships with the outer world while being deeply immersed in it is merely to recognize the need for an accountable and responsible entrepreneurship in our societies. We believe that this is important and this is necessary. Our economies can compete only at 3 levels. If you examine all of the development models in which economic competition becomes a critical part, first you compete at the level of price, then you compete at the level of quality, and then finally you compete at the level of creative innovation. And this is where we are trapped at this moment in our Caribbean worlds. We are not competing at the level of creative innovation. This is the moment. This is the moment for the unleashing of the Caribbean creativity in respect of innovation. We have competed at the level of price. We have competed at the level of quality. We are not competing at the level of creative innovation. But this is going to be the key that will unlock our potential. To do this, we have to focus upon education, research, and the commercialization of our ideas. There is still in the Caribbean a suspicion of the relationship between industry and academia. We do not have a highly developed research culture, but we are not going to achieve innovative creativity without respect for research and the application of research to value creation. Our universities are still not effectively aligned to this process. When we enter into Asia and we examine all of the remarkable development models, what we see at the core of it is a realignment of research, academia, entrepreneurship, and creative energy. Universities, industries articulated into a process of value creation and the redistribution of the wealth of that innovation. We are still disjointed in our development thinking. We are still disjointed in our development thinking. And we are disjointed because we have failed to recognize that how we imagine our nationalism is counter-revolutionary. All of these countries and islands imagining themselves as discrete historical nations. Every island believing in itself that it is a legitimate nation, when in fact it is just a community within the nation. The political logic of the last 50 years has been that the parts are seeking to be greater than the whole. That has been the contradiction of our development in the last 50 years. It is counter-revolutionary for every little community to see itself as a nation competing with its neighbors. These are just fragmented communities historically seeking unification. We have to recognize that our energies are splintered and fragmented in this madness of myopia that is endemic at this time to the Caribbean reality. When you read, for example, development models built around nations of 200,000 people, some are 200,000, some are 300,000, some are 400,000, some may be 1 million, 2 million. But the fact is that there are 200 million people in the Caribbean. From Mexico through the islands, right through to Colombia and to the wider Caribbean world, we have 800 million people who constitute the Caribbean. And we're not going to find the strength of that reality if we think in the fractured notions of nations built with 200,000 people. It is counter-revolutionary to think and to act that way in the context of Caribbean history. Nothing that is sustainable can be achieved with those systems of thought. They have reached the end of their absurdity. And this is where we are. How to put this revolution back on track. The indigenous peoples saw this world as one survival space. They would get in their canoes and they would travel from the islands to Mexico. We have found material artifacts in Mexico and Guatemala that were made in the islands of the Eastern Caribbean. We have found material goods in the Eastern Caribbean and Jamaica that were made in Guatemala and Belize, because the indigenous peoples had created a regional economy. They were moving from place to place. And what have we done? We have imposed upon an ancestral perception of the Caribbean as one place fractionalism, divisiveness, and absurdity. We have to wake up. We have to wake up from this. Then, of course, there is the language that divides us all. A civilization that is made up of dozens of languages, many of them inherited from our colonial legacies. We do not speak the languages of our neighbors. But yet, we maintain an educational system that does not make it as mandatory that every child in the Caribbean should be speaking Spanish and English as a norm. What kind of future are we going to imagine in this Caribbean world if every child is not speaking Spanish and English, and as many other languages as possible? How can we proceed with this? How can we imagine a Caribbean economic future without that basic fundamental of communication? How are we going to imagine it? I was a student in the UK back in the 70s and 80s, and I remember very well when in Europe they said all the children have to learn Spanish and French and English. Every child must learn 2 languages. They took a serious decision because they were building the European Union, and they knew that the European Union was contingent upon every citizen being able to communicate across the languages of Europe. We have to take this on as a necessary part of empowering the younger generation to take responsibility for this Caribbean. And how are we going to do this? We have to invest much, much more in the education of our younger people. At the moment,